Irish people are very hospitable. We're very sensitive to issues of justice and welfare. That's why we're so friendly and so aligned with the Palestinian cause. But on Ukraine, I think the Irish people have been duped in some respects regarding the background to this conflict, about why it started, how it happened. Many Irish people were very ignorant about the Ukrainian situation. They believe that Vladimir Putin rolled out of bed under his volcano on the 24th of February 2022, stuck a pin in a map, and said, I'm going to invade that poor country that's never done anything to anybody. It hasn't been bombing the civilian population, the Russian ethnic population in Donbass for 10 years. It hasn't killed probably around 8,000 civilians. Its army hasn't tortured people. NATO hasn't been building an army on the border of Russia. So that context, the Irish people have had, I think they've changed now to a significant degree, and I'll tell you why. They had adopted this drive-through narrative. Everything at the moment we need in a blink. No one wants to read a book. No one wants to study. I mean, I might have studied, I might have read up on this stuff, and I might be passionate about it. But most people are so preoccupied in Europe, and I'd say in the United States, most working people are so preoccupied with feeding their kids, getting out to work, making sure that the bills are paid, that they can't look up from that. They can't take their noses out of that preoccupation. They live in very dangerous, dirty societies, very dysfunctional places politically. And that's very, very positive for maintaining the status quo of a very fertile environment for propaganda. And that's what happened. As soon as COVID ended, Vladimir Putin cured the world of COVID. It's remarkable. He's a remarkable man. Overnight, on the 24th of February, COVID disappeared. The world became preoccupied with Vladimir Putin, this madman from the East who was going to come and eat your baby for breakfast. So in many ways, people were conditioned through COVID. Whether you agree or disagree with the vaccine stuff is irrelevant. It's how governments very aggressively condition people. There's one truth. There's one right position. You either get the vaccine or you're a bad person. Now, look, I don't want to go into the vaccine stuff because I think that's a personal choice, whereas governments didn't.
Right.
But people were very much conditioned. It was a very depressing time. And then the Ukrainian conflict escalated. And it was an escalation. This war has been going on since 2014 at least, when a civil war began in Ukraine after the CIA backed a coup to remove the democratically elected president. You don't have to like the guy, but you have to accept that happened. Victoria Nuland, the Undersecretary of State in Ukraine, she admitted it on a phone call. The Russians' intelligence services released the phone call. She's never denied it's her on the call. She's picking the government in the post-coup Maidan. And the government consisted of far-right elements, neo-Nazis, the stooges of oligarchs, and the rest is history, if you like. So that civil war expanded into a very brutal conflict in the East. There were plans to end it. The Minsk Accords were agreed, but we've learned lately that the Minsk Accords were merely a ruse to help Ukraine build a bigger army, to take more NATO funding. And this is people like Angela Merkel saying this, that we never intended to actually do a deal with the Russians to federalize Ukraine, to let the very pro-Russian regions of Crimea, Donbass, Lugansk, and Zaporozhye have their integrity. Remember, if these regions were in any way aligned to America, the 82nd Airborne would have landed there to administer freedom, to free the crap out of them. That would have happened immediately, because everybody knows, including the Americans, the American State Department, the British know that demographically, the vast majority of people in that eastern part of Ukraine were pro-Russian. And that's to simplify it somewhat, but that's basically the situation. When I go back to Ireland now, when I first went back to Ireland, people would get out, leave bars, restaurants. They wouldn't, because I would have had a bit of a profile in Ireland because of the work I'd done. I supplied the information for a story which led to the Irish Prime Minister essentially getting arrested by appointment for leaking a $250 million document to his lover, basically best friend. And this was a big deal, and led to a 2-year-long investigation by the highest authorities in the Irish police for corruption and the breach of the Official Secrets Act, basically. So that sort of put me on the radar. And then, of course, people would have known me. So when I returned after coming to Russia to tell the story from here, people would get up and leave bars. They would leave restaurants. Members of my own family refused to speak to me, and still do. I mean, essentially, some members of my own family don't want to speak to me because of my views on what's happening here in Ukraine. So now when I return, people come up to me, thankfully, in the street, remarkably, on the airplane. Last time I was on my way home, people came up to me and thanked me for telling them what was happening because, for right or for wrong, everything I've said about the conflict in Ukraine and how it happened, how it began, how it's going to pan out, and the consequences of this NATO proxy war for Europe, a tidal wave of refugees, the destruction of Ukraine as a functioning country, the sale of it to big corporate interests, all of that's come true. And sadly, it's all come true. So, on a record of saying what would happen, I mean, I'm primarily against war. I'm against the conflict. I don't think the conflict, any war, is a good idea. But I don't. But I think some wars are inevitable. And one of the sort of key um, articles I've written about it is called "An Inevitable War," and I might give you the link to it. It's on the Islander and it's on Covert Action magazine, which sort of outlines how inevitable this war became once NATO decided that they were definitely going to push Russia on Ukraine. And people much smarter than me, people like Professor John Mearsheimer, have outlined this stuff succinctly, beautifully. People like Jeffrey Sachs. So we're not lone voices, but we're dangerous voices because we don't take the medicine, if you like, regarding the good guy, bad guy narrative, this drive-through narrative. People, as I say, can't look up from their busy lives right now because they're so crippled with debt and worried about the societal issues, which the same politicians who say they're going to save the world by defeating Russia and China are completely neglecting to do anything about the key issues like health, welfare, addiction, the things that are plaguing Irish society, UK society, and American society. So there's a huge deflection going on here now. Boris Johnson spent more time, I think, in Kiev than he did in 10 Downing Street during his prime ministership, including heading there to stop Volodymyr Zelensky signing a peace deal only weeks into the beginning of the conflict. So, I think that's the picture. I think now when I go home, people approach me and thank me. I mean, I've got a bigger following now. People know me for good or for bad. I'm either, infamous maybe from some people, but I try to remain respectful. I don't engage in sort of glorification of the war in any way. I don't believe in conflict as a way of sorting things out. Military conflict, it always ends
Yeah.
badly, but it always ends in negotiation. As I posted last night on my X, it will end. And 4 days before the conflict began, this phase of it, when the Russians crossed the border, I said, look, this will end in a negotiation.
Yeah.
Better that it will end now in a negotiation than over the graves of innumerable people with a huge crisis, an energy crisis. So, I think we just have to stay on the message as we say things as we believe them to be. And I think that's where we are.
Yeah, so many interesting points there. First of all, just how you mentioned the Minsk agreements, and it just made me think about, so many of these conflicts. Why would anybody trust the West anymore? I mean, like the Palestinians and the Israelis, right? Even just looking at that conflict, looking at the Minsk agreements between Ukraine and Russia, when the West has no real intention of upholding their end of the bargain, and they're pretty, with the Israelis, for example, they're blatant about it. They just say, "Oh yeah, we just want this agreement for now, and then we're just going to blow them. We just want our hostages back, and then we're just going to blow you to smithereens after." So why would anybody agree? And then people point the finger at Hamas and say, "Well, they're not agreeing." Well, why would you agree to that? Why would you agree to a temporary solution and then you're still going to come after us? And that's what's gone on with Ukraine, Russia. These pretend agreements. Why would we have just squandered our we've I don't know if I wanted to say we squandered our good name. I don't know if we've but then you have to kind of go back in history and say, well, when did we was it a fake good name? Did we deserve the good name? Did we squander it, or did we ever even have one to begin with? But the fact that we can't hold up to our end of the bargain, it's amazing that people don't wake up to that. We're pushing these countries and these people into inevitable war, right? That's what we did with Russia, as you pointed out, with NATO and the expansion and and that they warned over and over and over and over for decades. The Russians said, if you do this, it will end up, we're going to have no choice but to go to war with you. Same thing with the Palestinians. I mean, you lock them up in a cage for that long, and what do you think is going to happen? It's inevitable. And yet, even with and this we could point out, those are just the conflicts that are right on our radar right now. But if we look back at time, we would see that this is a theme that has gone on over and over and over again. And it's just amazing that we don't care, right? The West just continues pushing toward war, not caring at all under the I mean, what do you think it is that gives the West that emboldens the West to continue pushing and pushing? Do you think the West really thinks that if we go to war with Russia, for example, a hot war, that we would win? Do you think the West just thinks that there would never really be a war, that it's just a good way to build up the military industrial complex and posture? I mean, what do you think it is that makes the West renege on all of these agreements and continue pushing towards war?
Well, on a sort of a theoretical
Yeah.
platform, when you look at the Western foreign policy and the United States foreign policy, certainly since the end of the Second World War, the, you could go back as far as the Monroe Doctrine, where the United States basically wrote down that nobody in our neighborhood's going to screw with us. We'll either destroy them economically or militarily. That was basically the Monroe Doctrine. Then there was a corollary to that. There's been non-interventionist times in the United States where some presidents have said, look, we're going to focus inwards. The United States didn't want to get involved in the First World War, really, and it didn't want to get involved in the Second World War. I hear Americans telling me, oh, we won the war against the Nazis. I say, you didn't even want to join the war. The
Right.
Americans sat it out. And from my point of view, there was a rationale to that. But it was the attack on Pearl Harbor that brought America into the war, not the torturing and transporting of millions of Jews to their
Right.
deaths, or the knowledge that that was happening or going on or going to happen at least. So the U.S. has had these different fluxes. Then it had Vietnam after in the post-war period, the Korean War, which was a very very bloody engagement. And America sort of appointed itself or became the world policeman, particularly in the light of its development of the atomic bomb, the nuclear weapons. Now, the bombing of Japan, Nagasaki, and Hiroshima, some analysts would agree, and I would tend to agree with them, that that was probably unnecessary, but it was a moment where the United States demonstrated its global dominance as an
Yeah.
economic and military powerhouse. And it's very difficult for a country with that immense power, military and economic, to sate itself, to sort of say, we're done. We don't want to intervene anymore. Threats appear everywhere, and the political movement that grows from that, particularly in the light of the communist threat as it was perceived. We know about Hoover, and we know about this obsession in the United States with the Red Menace in the Soviet Union. There were never any real cohesive plans in the Soviet Union to invade Europe or anywhere else. The view in the Soviets was, simplifying it somewhat, was that the West is so corrupt and so terrible that they'll all eventually become socialist and communist anyway, because we don't really need to do much. We need to sit back. But this arms race, it created a reliance in American political life, in my view, on the military-industrial complex. This sort of very unhealthy relationship between the big political parties, which are whether it's left or right or Republican, is utterly irrelevant. Both receive vast influence and cash from the military-industrial complex. Remember, the United States buys and sells more weapons than every other country on earth combined.
Hmm.
It's an astounding amount of money. So, in order to sell your weapons across the globe, and the United States is probably the biggest seller of weapons too. The United States sells and buys more weapons than Russia and China combined, and India, and the next, I think, 3 or 4 countries down the list: the UK, France, Italy, and Spain. So, in order to create the conditions, like if fire disappeared tomorrow, if we found a solution for fire, that you never needed to light a fire again, light a match, a cigarette lighter, anything, it'd be very difficult to sell fire alarms, fire hoses, fire detection equipment, fire alarms. So there is a case of thought, and I believe that conflict on one side of the political spectrum is cultivated, particularly through fear. Remember, the United States is a country probably predicated on the genocide of one people, the American Indian, who were the first big enemy of the cohesive United States, or the fledgling United States, the redskin, and the enslavement of the black African, okay, who then in turn became the enemy of the American state through the 1940s, 50s, 60s, through the civil rights struggle, still experiencing huge racism and discrimination today in the United States. Uh, and then it moved on to, the Russians. For a while, it was the Japanese, interning huge amounts of Japanese civilians during the Second World War. A lot of this is a hidden history that people don't really want to talk about, how aggressively the United States treats its enemies in times of war and conflict. Guantanamo Bay being another case in point of imprisoning people without trial. So the spectrum of enemy has moved from the native Indian uh, up now to Russia and China. And even now, you hear people in the American political elite saying, well, Russia's not really our enemy. We're just having a bit of a falling out with them. The real enemy is China. And we're preparing now for a big war with China. And we're doing that by sailing fleets and arming a constituent part of China, which is Taiwan. Now, the One China policy, which the Americans are a signatory to, states that they accept that Taiwan is an integral part of Chinese territory. But yet they're supplying hundreds of millions of dollars worth of weapons to that country,
Yeah.
agitating for a war with probably the biggest, well, definitely the biggest manufacturing economy on earth, now the biggest navy on earth. And they're not building this navy in order to have a gay parade or a picnic. They're building this navy to do something. And Taiwan lies, very close off the coast of mainland China. And the Chinese have stated, like the Russians stated, again and again and again, any existential threat to our integral territory, we will react.
Right.
And a blockade of Taiwan would lead us to a catastrophic global collapse in the economy. So, in reality, this military industrial complex, the need for fear. And I mean, some people would say there's more weapons, there's more firearms than human beings in the United States. Guns kill more children in America than cancer. So a lot of this stuff comes from a societal need to tell people you need to be scared. You need to be scared of someone. You need your gun. Don't let them take your gun off you. That guy wants your gun. It's a very good way to control people into a fear and out of it, from the micro, and saying you need a shotgun under your bed, to the macro, saying we need the biggest army on the planet and we need to become the world's policeman to solve everyone's problems. Well, in fact, the United States has been involved in the overthrow of probably, since the Second World War, 50 countries around the world. It's been at the center of every major conflict. It's been responsible for the deaths of millions of civilians, millions of people, from carpet bombing North Korea to Vietnam to Laos to Cambodia, Syria, Afghanistan, Libya, Iraq, Grenada. I mean, we could be here all day talking about the crimes of the American war machine. And meanwhile, the American voter is so busy with his head in the cereal bowl trying to get the kids to school because things aren't good. The American dream isn't such a dream right now. That these peddled, centralized narratives of the Chinese and the Russians are out to get you. Your politicians with their beautiful bleached teeth and their nice blazers waving Israeli flags in your parliament. These are the good guys. The facts would state something otherwise. So I think something that we often miss psychologically in the States is fear. It's this perpetual state of fear, and mistrust against anybody that is anointed to be mistrusted by the intelligence controlled media. And we know that the intelligence community in the United States intimately controls the media. We know that through things like Operation Mockingbird. None of this stuff is made up. You feel free, guys, to go and check it out. And you'll find that this stuff is real, and it's very real. But there's also, billions of dollars spent to make sure you don't find out about it. And that's probably, to get back to one of your first points, is probably like why they don't want you listening to people like me on RT, and that's why it's bad.
Hey guys, this was just a clip of a longer show. Catch the full show by going to KimIversonShow.com. It is free. It airs Monday through Friday, 5 p.m. Pacific, 8 p.m. Eastern. You could go back now and watch this full interview. I highly recommend it. Again, go to KimIversonShow.com. Thank you so much for watching.